everyone. Assalamualaikum and good evening this evening, including our panelists, all of whom have so readily accepted our invitation in tonight's roundtable. This is our online conversation organized together with NUS Press. First of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to the US Press team, especially Peter Chotpradit, and every dedicated intern Wu for helping set up this web infrastructure, undertaking work. As Southeast Now, Direct in Contemporary and Modern Art in Asia is principally an academic journal. I would like to a heartfelt gratitude to the Foundation for the Arts Initiative and the Cheng Chong Sui program at Yale and US College for their support in keeping open access. To make a case why open access is important, I'm very pleased to give you the good news. For the past 5 months, our readership has jumped from an average to 8,000. This is really happening in response to the days of academic writing, arguing that academic publishing is not broader. I think when we make meaning open access, there's always a public out engaged with compelling research. And out of this reading public is also a community with the increase of our Facebook group membership to 4,000 plus strong members today. On behalf of our committee, I want to thank you for and your will to constantly give us in the scholarship community on the contemporary art of East Asia. Extremely humbled by this. The idea for tonight's roundtable grew out of our recent special on teaching contemporary art of Asia. Here I'd like to acknowledge Rogerson's editorial stewardship in collecting the anthology of reflections you can read in this issue on Project News Online. The popularity of the special issue spurred us into thinking how we can continue this conversation, perhaps to also prospect a way of the changing circumstances that we're facing together under this global pandemic, coming together spaces in teaching and the study of art can take place across Asia in our time. Anyways, this has been a long-for desire for many of us. Countlessly profess to us colleagues as we brush past in conference. I promise that it's a pandemic to break untenable of disease, to spend more time deliberating together on what many of us value today or most as educators. Here I want to thank the faculty for the Arts Initiative for generously to us during the global lockdown and offered an additional support. We're still trying to make sense of what's happening around the world. This generosity and commitment has enabled us to come out of the period stronger with a renewed commitment to further our community around the journey online series is part of. With that, let's begin. I'm going to pass the floor to my co-moderator and colleague, Achan Thanavi Chotpradit from Silpakorn University, a bit on why we're doing this. I'm going to start. Thanavi, Achan. Sorry, you have to yourself, Achan.
You're right. ขอบคุณค่ะ Thank you, Simon, and good evening, everyone. As Simon has mentioned, the popularity of the roundtable essay in the latest issue of Southeast of Now has really encouraged us to think about how we are going to bring this into an actual discussion and to engage more with our readers. We organized this online roundtable in a hope that we will kickstart a lively conversation within and beyond the region, also for some other issues to come. So this evening, we are delighted to bring together educators from different institutional contexts across Southeast Asia. They are going to reflect on their pedagogical philosophies and experiences, as well as answering to new challenges and opportunities faced by educators today in our part of the world with the transition into online learning. This online roundtable on teaching the study of art in Southeast Asia will take 2 hours. So we will start with a 10 minutes presentation by the 6 panelists, followed by the questions from Simon and me, and then of course a Q&A session for all of you. So you're very welcome to ask, to share, to respond in whichever way that you feel comfortable with. The discussion will also explore how the teaching of art converses with the growing call to address prevailing forms of discriminatory practices and racism. Before we start, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce briefly our panelists. This won't be long, since their profiles have already been posted a few days earlier on Facebook. So I guess many of you have already seen them. So our first panelist is Dr. Flaudette Datuin from the Department of Art Studies, University of the Philippines. And then the second panelist would be Dr. Eksuda Singhalampong, my colleague from the Department of Art History, Silpakorn University. Then Dr. Priya M. Jaradi from the Department of History from the National University of Singapore. The fourth panelist would be Dr. Clare Veal from the MA program Asian Art History from LASALLE College of the Arts, Singapore. And then Dr. Sarena Abdullah from the School of the Arts, Universiti Sains, Malaysia. And our last panelist is Miss Brigitta Isabella from the School of Improper Education, KUNCI Study Forums and Collective, who is also our editorial collective. So I'm going to pass the floor to our first panelist, Dr. Flaudette. Please come. Thank you.
Just have to remember to unmute ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajahn Thanavi. Magandang gabi sa inyong lahat. Good evening, and I'm happy to be here. And I hope that I'll be also learning from the other distinguished panelists. I am from the University of the Philippines, and the University of the Philippines is a system of campuses all over the nation. I teach at UP Diliman, Metro Manila, and that is the flagship campus. My home unit is the College of Arts and Letters, and which has 5 departments, and one of them is the Department of Art Studies. Just a little historical background. It used to be the Department of Humanities and is an offshoot of an outgrowth of the Department of English in the 1960s. It was renamed Department of Art Studies in the 80s, and I joined the department as a faculty member around that period. The department is the only one of its kind and the oldest in the Philippines, if not in Southeast Asia. The question we always ask ourselves is that we're already more than 3 decades as an art studies department, and why are we the only one? So it's not a very popular and very known field as compared to the more mainstream disciplines of engineering, law, music, and sometimes we get mistaken for fine arts, which is more mainstream and more established. So the shift from humanities to art studies will probably become clearer when I outline very broadly, in broad terms, the key pedagogical philosophy of the department. The approach is, of course, critical. And the very first thing that we ask in all courses across graduate and undergraduate and even general education courses is, what is art? And so one direction we have pursued for the longest time is the expansion of the parameters of art and the deconstruction of the canon. So it's not a given, it's not absolute, it's not universal. And we are informed by critical theory, post-colonial approaches, gender theories, cultural studies, anthropological studies, and others. So art is historicized, deconstructed, redefined, demystified, and unmasked for its colonial and elitist roots We are critical of the canons of art, as I have said earlier, and the institutions that have shaped them. So in art studies, we conceive of art broadly, encompassing forms which may not traditionally be thought of as art. So this refers not just to the usual suspects of the fine arts, but a broad array of creative products and environments, photographs in social media, street theater, rap music, weaving, movie billboards, malls, tabloids, realist drama, installations, montage, epics, urban planning, ballet, pictures, etc., from television to monuments. And there are key disciplines, 4 key disciplines with which we frame this broad array or this study of art, namely art history, with which we suffer the anxiety of context, art criticism, art theory and aesthetics, curation, and arts management. So the broadening of the field of art is very much part of the position that art is socially relevant and can be a platform for critical discourse and social change. Art is a human activity that comes in the form of a medium that can be accessed by and through the senses. In the vernacular, we call this danas or dama, which has to do with keen perception, poesis, and strengthening our imagination through the senses, keen sensory perception. So we start with form, of course, and the questions that we ask when we talk about form, for example, we ask, how does a situation become theatrical? How does cinema present its conflicts? And how is a screenplay different from a dialogue in a novel or a play? How does sound become music? And of course, you have to talk of the context and how each culture prioritizes how to organize sound. And how does movement become dance? How is space translated into architecture? And how does a scene become cinematic? And beyond the codified forms of art, we can even venture to more mundane matters and examine, for instance, our manner of dressing, our tastes, gestures, expressions of joy and grief, our sense of well-being, comfort, health, among others, and realize the various ways we embody and embed the world through our thinking, feeling, and acting bodies. But the strongly formalist approach is no longer tenable, and rather form is discussed in relation to society, culture, gender, the environment, colonialism, the nation, and others. Form is value-laden, as the late critic Alice Guillermo has always repeatedly taught us, and is not separate from content and context. So the art and society perspective thus necessitates us to do both close and cross readings. In other words, art is seen as intertextual and as shaped and located within various spheres. For example, what is the relationship of the luster and thickness of oil in a, say, Arturo Luz, a national artist, painting to the politics of patronage and capitalist consumption? And when confronted with a mural in, say, one of our buildings like Palma Hall or the UP Chapel, we ask, why are they so big? What makes them special? Is it because they were painted by national artists? Why is medieval painting flat? Why is Renaissance painter so hung up with linear perspective? What does a picture of fruits and food tell us about the eating habits of people in a more solo painting? And come to think of it, what does a fugue tell us about religion in the time of Bach? There is a conscious effort, in other words, to make students know about Philippine art forms, and this is the third direction the movement towards local knowledge and epistemologies, they're the same, and framed as part of broader national, regional, Southeast Asia and Asian global context. This reflects the strong nationalist orientation of the department, which has always been critical of Euro-American centric legacies of art history, but in constant dialogue with the world. So we train students also in art production. No, we don't, but we do have a curatorial track, so we call that art production as well. And it was agreed the students, particularly our majors, are all expected to articulate their ideas competently through writing, which we conceive of as a form of practice and praxis. In other words, when you write well, you think well. Broadly, our students go on to become cultural workers, museum professionals, writers, and more importantly, teachers, because that is how we achieve the multiplier effect. In September, our classes will be purely online or on remote mode because Metro Manila has the highest number. It's the epicenter of the COVID outbreak in the Philippines. This is a challenge, particularly because art has to be seen in person and experienced keenly. Materiality is lost. Not to mention, we do not really have the infrastructure. Not all students have Wi-Fi connections and access to gadgets. Resources will have to be sourced online as well. So that's a challenge. So the environment has shifted from face-to-face to computer screens and monitors. And there's a lot of difference when we view images via our screens, right? Our readings or our essays could reflect the shift from reception to remediation, therefore, with a keen attention to shifts in media and qualities of seeing, thinking, and feeling. But it also has a lot of opportunities. For example, during the time of COVID, netizens have become very creative. For example, in the field of culinary arts, sushi has become deconstructed. Cookies are smothered with spice. That's one of the things that my daughter is exploring right now. Delivery modes, we have become very creative in that field. That is a good start. No, we could talk about food and cross-reference food with, let's say, the still life in all environments. What we could see from the museums, virtual museums, etc. Or we can pick up a landscape painting and cross-reference it with pictures of deserted streets in the time of lockdown. Or we can start the class by asking, where have you been in social media? What have you been watching? And then we can take it from there. So again, I refer to the shift from art to a refunctioned humanities and on to art studies. The main philosophy here, or the theoretical viewpoint, is that art is not just a parade of artists and objects. It's not a collector's item. Art objects are not collector's item, as Janet Winterson would say. Let the noun become an active force. So art are not just about objects, but art objects. And it is keynote of, and this is the bedrock of our philosophy, and based on art as an agent of social change and a vital part of, in the words of our late Alice Guillermo, in the making of history towards a human and just order, which still eludes our grasp at the present. So I hope that is a good start for discussion later. So I look forward to exploring more issues with you. Thank you. Maraming salamat.
Thank you for that. And next, I would like to welcome Dr. Eksuda Singhalampong from Silpakorn University, Bangkok.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Thanavi. And I'm very grateful for this kind invitation to share our experiences among a lecturer of the art and art history. This evening, I will start off with a short walk down the memory lane that my institution, my workplace, Silpakorn University, originated from as an art school. Then, with luck, it was elevated to university. Department of Art History, where I work now, where I am a staff member, is under one of the very first faculty that established when the Silpakorn became a university. So I think this makes the teaching of art history stands on a very solid starting point in terms of academic program and policy of the institution. It is quite fair to state that art education is the heart of Silpakorn University, and teaching study of art either in practice or theories has always been Silpakorn University's strong suit. And I said that, of course, this was the time or well before the university have been turned into a business enterprise, which I'm sure is not just a unique case for Thailand. It is the situation as elsewhere in the world. So I finished with the sweet memory, and then start with my experience to share with to all of you here. My students are the undergraduate students from the second to the fourth year. I would like to give the basic of how we as an art history teacher prepare the students coming in with broad and varied backgrounds into our history courses. So the first and the second year students must take 4 introduction to art history classes, from which they will learn the art of ancient India art and its influence in Southeast Asian region. Then the second one is the art history of Thailand from ancient time to, I'm not sure it will reach early modern, but we will come back for that later. So the third one is the East Asian art history. And the fourth one is the history of Western art. This fundamental course was designed, as you can see, that it's based on the principles of regions and its periods, like from the ancient to the pre-modern. It could be said that not only these fundamental courses is based on regions and periods. It's a majority of art historical classes at the department that follow this model as well. And it will cause quite I think it's not quite a problem, but it will limit the skill for the students. Because from this point onward, the art history students will likely choose the following classes based on their preferred regions. Like maybe some students that take the final fundamental class, which is the history of Western art, which I and Thanavi is also a lecturer in that class. Some students doesn't like Western art for some reason, so they will take the other routes. Maybe they will learn 4 years in the degree and don't want to take other Western art history at all. Even among us, not just the student, even among us teachers, we casually dubbed our art classes in the department the Eastern art camp and the Western art camps. Though they really are not the case, because it's very polarization between the class or the art history subjects that teach in the department that couldn't or shouldn't be classified as region. I will come back to that later in my subject. Okay, so I started my career as a lecturer at Silpakorn University in late 2008. Then I took my study leave from early 2012 to mid 2016, after which I resumed teaching immediately. So this 4-year hiatus was, for me at that point, like a culture shock because of the change in teaching technique and students of these generations' perception and lookout, as well as the change within the department. Because before I left, teaching art history in Southeast Asia at the department used to focus on a pre-modern era, like ancient India, ancient Cambodia, ancient Burma, and etc. So when I resumed my position, apart from the subject that it's my duty to do from the Western art camp, the ancient Greek and Roman art and medieval art in Europe, I teach the relatively new class on early modern art of Thailand, the subject that I explore in my PhD dissertation and continue to do so in my research. Not only me, but with Thanavi, my colleague, who also presents here tonight, this evening, who completed her PhD a year earlier. Then we passed another colleague of mine a few years later from mine. The teaching on modern art and contemporary art of Thailand in our department has steadily and positively progressed. As for my early modern art of Thailand class, at first, it went quite well, but then in recent years, the materials which have been the main focus of my PhD dissertation and research, namely the Western style architecture built during the late 19th to early 20th century, to say the least, have been the subject of urban development and gentrification in Bangkok and elsewhere in Thailand, in many big main cities. So in the beginning, with these changes, I was quite anxious about both the state of the work of art itself and their effect on my teaching because of the material, that it won't be the same, or it will cannot be accessed easily to public. Then I took up this obstruction as an opportunity to guide and encourage my students to criticize the hypocrisy and contradiction in the government's policy regarding historical sites. So in so doing, both parties and teachers and students have to build a classroom environment and a learning culture in which the students can actively apply the knowledge and learning skill on art history to participate in such movement. So here's my take on the pedagogical philosophy. I would like to see that teaching art history at the undergraduate level should not only cover the fundamental or study art history in order just to dating or identify artworks of certain periods of regions, which is a norm quite not a few years back, like many years ago in the department. So the teaching and the study of art history in Thailand could be more relevant to the changes in socio-cultural landscape around us. Following this line of thought, the collaboration in the region concerning study of art in Southeast Asia perhaps could be done so by considering our shared concerns of issues in art. For instance, I'd like to drop the name again. Earlier this year, my colleague Thanavi and Vipat organized a workshop for our students in collaboration with LASALLE College of the Arts and Singapore Biennale. We took our student, few of our students to do a workshop there. So we can start with this co-working between maybe from not BA, but from MA or graduate student, and see which direction and this collaboration can lead to. So this is my reflection on concerning my experiences in studying and teaching art history. I will look forward to your more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ajahn Eksuda. Okay. Next, I would like to welcome Dr. Priya, please.
Okay. Let me begin by thanking Simon, Thanavi, and Peter for putting together this very timely webinar. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Now, the way I've structured this paper is around 3 time periods which allow me to reflect on the making of an art history program at the National University of Singapore. So let me begin with the first phase between the 1950s to the 1970s, which is actually documented in great detail by our esteemed colleague, Professor T.K. Sabapathy. Now, it was way back in 1952 when the British Colonial Offices Commission recommended an undergraduate art history program at what was then the University of Malaya. And subsequently, in 1955, the university's own art museum was established. So there are 3 points which I wish to highlight in this particular development in the 1950s. Firstly, the art history curriculum and the art museum both debuted as a shared and a very tightly braided enterprise. In line with that, the first 2 lecturers, Michael Sullivan and William Willits, also served as curators at the Art Museum. And thirdly, I wish to highlight the revisionist sensibilities of these 2 lecturers, which ensured inclusion of Indian, Chinese, and Southeast Asian topics in their modules, and this despite the paucity of surveys on Asian art at that time. Now, their collection building policies too recognized similar categories which we all know were outside the domain of colonial or Eurocentric art histories. But unfortunately, this very thoughtfully charted road to decolonizing the field met with abrupt closure in 1973. Now, the road to recovery brings me to the second part of my reflection. As we all know, or some of us know, after 45 years, art history has been revived as a collaboration between the National University of Singapore and the National Gallery Singapore, and the program was publicly launched in 2017. In the absence of any immediate pedagogical inheritance, as convener, I'd like to say that this program imbibed one guiding principle, which is the mutually constitutive nature of curatorial sensibilities, museums, and art history. And this principle has also molded our very young program's philosophy, structure, and scope. Both the university and the gallery remain acutely aware of the program's position in time and place, due to which we commit to 4 aspirations. 1 is to be post-colonial, 2nd to being transcultural, 3rd, of course, as I've pointed out, is our firm belief in the reciprocal relationship between museums and art history. And 4th is to strike that delicate balance between maintaining a Southeast Asian core while adopting a global art histories approach. Inordinately ambitious for a minor program, but as I've always said, it's one thing to have these guiding philosophies on our program brochures and promotion materials, but it's quite another to translate these principles into our day-to-day crafting of modules, lecture topics, and modes of delivery. So allow me to assess if we have indeed been able to fulfill these commitments in our 3-year run, which we just completed. And I will verify these commitments against 3 aspects of our pedagogy. Of course, there are many more, but in the interest of time, we'll stick to 3. The first one concerns our modular spread. Now, abiding by post-colonial studies, the post-colonial studies turn, and even global art histories, more recent propositions to include overlooked sites, spaces, and temporalities, I'd say our modular spread and topical range ensures a very wide east-west arc, material, and a temporal arc. The introductory module underlines that the historical development of art has always been a global one. And at a time when national cartographies are being viewed as less useful within the discipline, our core modules are mindfully crafted so that Southeast Asia and Singapore are located within a transcultural framework. And this, you will appreciate, allows us to avoid the pitfalls of any reverse ethnocentrisms or any unnecessary projections of a race or a place-based genius. The second aspect of our pedagogy involves a robust mobilization of museum-based resources, which in our case is primarily the National Gallery Singapore, and of course our own University Museum, which is the NUS Museum. Now, these frequent museum visits ensure that students are viewing objects outside the constellation of what we call standard textbook pieces. And the gallery's curators, who double as lecturers on our program, much like Sullivan and Willits in the 50s and 60s, bring intimate knowledge of exhibition-initiated discourses. And again, we have lots of examples, and the gallery's colleagues will excuse me for citing just one this evening. I'm going to refer to our module, Critical Introduction to Modern Art, which is taught by Dr. Phoebe Scott and Dr. Roger Nelson. Now, this module has had the brilliant opportunity to tap into the permanent displays of the gallery alongside a series of special exhibitions such as Reframing Modernism. Now, these exhibitions interweave art from Southeast Asia into a story of global modernism. And the learning outcomes from these visits, these museum visits, are immense because students grasp the aspirations to reframe the canon both in art historical teaching and via curatorial practice. It is one thing to mobilize these museum-based resources to illustrate our art history lessons, but really the question remains, how do we achieve the reverse, right? How do we demonstrate the application of seemingly abstract methods and concepts which are used in the classroom to practice-based work while retaining our Southeast Asian core and our relevance to the Singapore context? So this brings me to the third aspect of our pedagogy, which is a slightly more niche discussion on a particular module that we teach, methods and approaches to art history. Now, I've shrunk this portion in the interest of time, but I'd love to come back during the Q&A to this. I'm going to draw on my favorite classroom-based exercise in this module on theories and methods, where we read the Singaporean artist Charles Lim's multimedia works through our art historian colleague Kevin Chua's writings on Lim's work. Now, Chua has very elegantly demonstrated how Wolflin's foundational method of formal analysis is as important to understanding a contemporary work by Lim as might be an alternative anthropological route, which helps us to locate Lim's contemporary works in a long history of pre-colonial practices in the region. And of course, indirectly, this example helps us to fulfill global art history's endeavor to look beyond geopolitical frameworks or national cartographies. Now, to me, more importantly, an exercise such as this reinstates art history's position as being foundational to museum and curatorial practice. I hope I'm saying this on behalf of the community of educators in response to certain remarks that were made at the Frieze Art Fair a few years ago, when it was thought that art history was becoming increasingly obsolete and ill-equipped, especially to curators who dealt with contemporary and multimedia works. But well, here we are, interpreting a contemporary and a multimedia work through older foundational and classical methods in the field alongside very current writings and approaches. Now, before I move to the third and the final phase of this reflection, I want to pause and point out that this very short assessment that I made of the history and the philosophy of our program was written in a pre-pandemic moment, and parts of this presentation were made internally between the gallery, between the university, and at the CAA Getty platform earlier this year. But of course, by March of this year, the COVID-19 situation escalated in Singapore, and all of us had to shift rapidly to online teaching. And that situation is not over, as has been mentioned by my colleagues. I suppose all of us are grappling with the forthcoming semester, which is meant to be virtual. So I think the big question facing all of us is that, is online teaching here to stay? How does it affect the teaching of art history, if at all? Now, how does it affect our commitment to mobilize museum-based resources and to retain our post-colonial and transcultural personality? I have two thoughts in the form of a very, very preliminary response. So first, I think there is no pretending that our physical museum visits will remain somewhat constrained in the near future, and we will all have to rely on pre-recorded sessions or sessions such as these, which are streamed live from within the museum space. And as has been mentioned by Flaudette, there's no arguing this cannot replace the immediacy of the experience of being in a museum. So at best, these virtual sessions will provide a reasonable substitute to carry on teaching and learning. But in terms of the second point, retaining our post-colonial and transcultural aspirations, I have very different and perhaps a positive take on that. And I'm going to draw an analogy with the digitization of archives, which has happened so rapidly in our part of the world in the last 5 to 7 years. Now, at various seminars, we've all agreed that moving archival materials from a physical repository or a physical record room to a digitized space allows us to make connections between very disparate materials, geographies, and cultures. And that leads to the possibility of writing new critical art histories. A similar trajectory then should be possible when it comes to our online museum education resources, particularly our online collections. But I feel like up until here, these online resources have been viewed as somewhat secondary to our standard teaching and learning materials. And by standard, I mean a combination of our classroom lectures and our museum visits, which are almost typically always accompanied by slides and reading materials in the form of book chapters or journal articles, right? But I wonder if for the forthcoming virtual semesters, these online resources could be emphasized as crucial reference and learning materials. And I'm particularly thinking of our colleague Simon Soon's workshop, which focuses solely on digital materials to study the colonial period. Now, this sort of a digital interface might lead us to make increasing cross-border connections. Of course, what kind of data will we bring back to the disciplinary fold is a question. And my sense is that this could range from micro themes and micro histories to exceptionally big picture data, which could then lead us to that penultimate moment in making art history truly inclusive. So to conclude, I do not think the future of pedagogy in art history is about privileging the digital over the physical or vice versa, but I think it is more about blended learning, to borrow the Ministry of Education's oft repeated phrase in the context of Singapore. Cohort after cohort, I think, has been trained with what have become standard modes of teaching and learning in art history. But who knows, in deviating from that standard and moving to a more blended model, we may produce new ways of thinking. Additionally, the transcultural and the global dimension of art history may well stand to gain. That is my sense. And that's it from me. Thank you. Thanks, Thanavi.
Thank you, Priya. And next, I would like to invite Dr. Clare Veal from LASALLE College of the Arts.
Hey, thank you, Thanavi, Simon, and Peter for the invitation to speak tonight. And I've already learned so much from my esteemed colleagues' presentation, so I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A after this. So I thought I would begin tonight just with a brief introduction to the MA Asian Art Histories program that I teach at LaSalle College of the Arts, Singapore, just to give some background about art historical pedagogy and some of the transformations that I think are coming with along with the pandemic situation that we find ourselves in. So the MA Asian Art Histories program is the only master's level program of its type in the world that focuses on modern and contemporary art of Asia. We attract a real diverse range of students to the course, and that is in terms of their age, which ranges from 20s to 70s, their cultural backgrounds as well as their professional backgrounds. And so this means that students are coming to us with a really broad range of knowledge and experience, both of art from the region, but also art history more generally. So some of them will be extremely knowledgeable and others will be starting from scratch. The program is also situated within an art school context, so we are part of the McNally School of Fine Arts alongside colleagues teaching in the diploma, bachelor's and master's programs in fine arts. But we also engage with a number of interdisciplinary collaborations with other MA programs at the college, including creative writing, design, art pedagogy, art therapy and others. The program as a whole is primarily informed by a research-led pedagogy, which means that while we are conscious to introduce students to a really broad range of subject matter in the modules themselves, our primary focus is really developing in them the sort of research skills and methodologies required to undertake their thesis, which they begin in the second semester of the course. So within this, my own kind of personal approach to teaching art history, which is developed in my time teaching as part of the program for the past 4 years, it can be divided into sort of two parts. The first of which is having a critical focus on art historical methods and how these can be articulated and rethought in relation to Asian and Southeast Asian subject matter. And the second focus is really the relevance of art history to art practice and vice versa. And more than that, how we might start to think of art history as a type of practice. And I know May mentioned that in her talk a few minutes ago. And for me, this really includes being quite mindful of how the discipline can be relevant to different communities in the present. But it doesn't mean only focusing on the contemporary. Instead, sort of following someone like the art historian Keith Moxey, I really like to encourage students to think about how images produce, transform, and are embedded within different temporalities and in relation to various audiences and locales. And in turn, in what ways art history in itself can speak to and be responsible to various publics. So moving to how this kind of pedagogical focus has been maintained or adjusted given the recent COVID situation. So the lockdown and the closure of international borders really came towards the end of our last semester, when the majority of our face-to-face classes were already completed. So the impact was largely felt by our graduating students who were sort of forced to cancel their fieldwork, which meant that they weren't able to engage with archives, collections, or undertake interviews with artists or curators in person. For our junior cohort, it meant that a lot of the activities that we normally use to engage students with art objects and collections, including gallery visits, were also cancelled. So for me, the main kind of disruption that occurred was really in this sort of forced transformation in the physicality of undertaking research and teaching. And I think it's very easy for us to think about this in terms of a loss, and certainly, as many of my colleagues have already said, you know, engaging with art or even engaging with archives or undertaking interviews online is certainly not the same as doing it in person. But in this way, I also think that this transformation has the potential to sort of develop in our students an awareness of the ways in which the conditions, temporalities and spatialities in which we encounter images, documents, people, impact the way in which we interpret these materials. So in my preparations for next semester, I'm thinking about how to kind of use this moment to provoke students to really consider how art historical interpretation can be expanded beyond that kind of moment of artistic creation, and how this might in turn help us read along and against the grain of different materials and perhaps allow feminist post-colonial interpretations or even decolonial thinking to come to the fore. So in the context of Southeast Asia, I also think this transformation in the embodied nature of conducting research can also be used to start a conversation with our students about how to critically relook at the assumed relationships between the form of our encounters with different materials and how we assess the kind of reliability or usefulness of those materials. And I think Priya has touched on that a moment ago, which is, for example, do we dismiss a kind of poorly photocopied image of a lost or destroyed work in favour of a work that we can view in person? Or how do we deal with materials, photographs, reproductions of works that are shared on social media or online forums where there is no metadata information about the date or the artist? And so I think this, for students, really opens up a conversation about how such evaluations might promote or silence different perspectives or voices, or indeed how expanding our research to include these materials might challenge art historical methodologies or the modes through which we communicate our research. So moving on from this kind of discussion of research to teaching in online classes, I think this issue of temporal and spatial difference also has some implications for how we might present online classes. So this involves perhaps considering the different sort of environments that students might be learning in, what interfaces they are using, whether they are constantly being interrupted by family. And I think that there is a real need for us to be extremely sensitive and compassionate at this moment, given the personal and professional problems that a lot of students are facing. And so developing a sort of awareness of these differences means that we can respond to them flexibly and critically in order to allow students to engage with their classes in the best way possible. So some of the things that I'm thinking about currently is what sort of new conversations can be developed when we move, for example, from orally analysing an image or text in class to collectively annotating these on Google Docs or on Zoom, and what happens if we sort of expand our range of communication in doing this to include, I don't know, for emojis or memes or hyperlinks in these sort of discussions. I also am considering the difference between the embodied experience of listening to a pre-recorded lecture versus giving live lectures to class. On the one hand, while pre-recorded lectures allow students facing personal and professional challenges to more easily balance their learning with other commitments, live lectures allow for greater kind of interpersonal discussion. I also think we might consider giving instructions for students to consume materials in a certain way. For example, pre-recording a lecture and instructing students to consume it outside as a sort of socially distanced Shantiniketan model. So I think here there is a certain latitude for experimentation and creativity, but what's important to me is recognizing the way in which these modes of presentation can produce different sort of knowledges as well as different temporalities and spatialities of learning. And that's something I think that we need to really consciously consider. So for me, the pandemic situation has sort of reinforced the fact that, like research, teaching and education cannot really operate in this totalizing, disembodied manner that is, whether it's in a classroom or online. So I think the opportunity here is to really develop in students and in ourselves a critical awareness of the situatedness of certain knowledges, as well as how one is positioned in relation to the field and the responsibilities that come with that. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And next, I would like to move to Dr. Sarena Abdullah from University Sains, Malaysia, who is dealing with another set of students.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Firstly, I would like to thank both Thanavi and also Simon, and of course Peter, for organizing this session. Let me go straight ahead in terms of my own introduction and to where I'm coming from. So as Thanavi has mentioned just now, I'm teaching art history at School of the Arts in Universiti Sains, Malaysia. So School of the Arts or Pusat Pengajian Seni was actually an offshoot, similarly like Flaudette's situation. It is an offshoot from a program, fine arts programs from School of Humanities in the same university. Significantly later, the Arts Center was established, and later in 1999 only that the center established itself as a faculty. So I have been teaching this faculty or school, in USM this called school. So it basically takes over or goes or follows the American system. Okay. So I've been teaching here at School of the Arts for the last 10 years. Okay. So in the fine arts department. So the rest of the program are theater, music, and 3 more design programs, which are graphic design, new media, and also product design. So I mostly teach 2 art history paper, which is Malaysian modern art and also modern Asian art. 1 theory paper and also 1 survey paper at 100 level. The survey paper includes 4 weeks of introduction of studio practice. Basically, I'm teaching art history to studio students, okay, fine art studio students. So I might not have the liberty of exploring in depth or having pertinent or in-depth conversation with colleagues who are also doing art history. So most of my colleagues are actually studio practitioners, okay? So the whole program is designed as a BFA program, but the naming of the program is still in its current or in the older form when it was established under the School of Humanities, which is Bachelor of Arts in bracket Fine Arts. Okay, so in this school I also supervise masters and also PhD candidates, preferably Malaysia or Southeast Asia topic, but now I'm also supervising topics that examines cross-cultural exchanges between selected countries in Asia and elsewhere. So with the current pandemic situation, we have sort of like abruptly we're required to go online. My biggest challenge is student engagement, of course. Even in a normal classroom student background, I must be, upfront at the fact that the students are more interested in fine arts because they are here for the fine arts program, okay? So, and they are not necessarily interested in history or art history, okay? So, since we have been going online, okay, although most of my students are mostly committed in terms of their synchronous classroom, it is quite hard to ascertain who are actually really interested, or if they are not interested, due to the fact that most of the students turn off their video and also not as active in asking questions. But in reality, when we have in a normal lecture setting, it is quite normal if the students are being quiet in class all the time, but being you physically in the lecture hall with them, you can always sort of like get them to ask questions and all that, in which such facilities sort of like quite limited in terms of the online teaching. But at least in terms of content, going a lot online allows me to share, at least in our e-learning platforms, either online resources from YouTube and galleries and museums, websites, etc. as much. Okay, we have the e-learning platforms which is already there, and the university has always encouraged encourage us to use that. But of course, you know, art historians being art historians, we prefer to, you know, lecture physically, you know, having those platonic kind of engagement in class rather than asking them to do blended learning on top of what they have to, you know, take up, you know, going to lectures and all that. So, but sometimes with all of these online sources, okay, choosing what is appropriate and suitable is also a pertinent issue or a very important aspect to consider, as some content might be too heavy or wordy, and even the English accent, because most of the contents are in English here, and the classes that I'm teaching are mostly in Malay language. So the problem would be if it's too long, some of the videos, if it's too long, or if the English accent will be like too, you know, too heavy for them. So it can be quite hard for them to understand what is being presented. You know, if I were to share a video in the e-learning as well. So for the Malaysian modern classes, for example, I observed that there are many, not many, but there are quite a few galleries, like Ilham, for example, had uploaded more YouTube contents, so which I welcome. Okay, so I hope that more galleries will do so, as this could help in creating more online sources that we could use in the future. Meaning that next semester, because I still have to, you know, concentrate, or, you know, I'm still stuck with online teaching next semester. Okay, so but you know, with such condition, this would you know, would present less opportunity for my students to do field work. Okay, in one of my subjects, which is Malaysian modern art, I always take the opportunity to, as one of the core assignment, to assign the students to do an interview with artists. Okay, you must understand in the context of you know, fine art students, as a person who teaches art history, my main consideration will be like, how do I get student artists to be interested with art history? Okay, how can they see art history as something that is relevant in their own art practice? Okay, so the opportunity for them to do field work, I would ask them to do a face-to-face interview with artists, with Malaysian artists. Okay, I usually enlist the names of artists that they can choose from, in hope that these assignments or these interviews can inspire them in their own art practice, and also even to show them the variation of artworks and also medium used by Malaysian artists today. To most students, this will be the first time that they meet a real practicing artist. If they are lucky enough, the artist will invite them to their studios and show them their works, how, you know, the behind scenes of how they produce their works. Okay, so I am forever indebted to artists that had opened their doors to many of my students over the years. Okay, Azizan Paiman, Awang Damit, Ilan, Umi Baizura, among others. There are many. I try to sort of like either following a certain thematical approach when I'm giving them these assignments, or so that I do not overburden the artist's commitment in helping out with our students, you know. So since what I'm dealing with in day-to-day basis are not art historians or future art historians or or students wanting to work in a museum or gallery settings, okay, philosophically, I am just interested, you know, I'm just happy if I could be able to get my students to be more critical, and to be critical in their art making, and also critical in the way that they think. okay? And they do not see themselves as only makers or doers, okay? Through art, that they can not only initiate new ideas, okay, by making art themselves, it is not only about initiating new ideas, but of course engaging with audience in the whole thought process behind the work. So by producing the artwork itself, that they have the opportunity to engage or present a different kind of communication through the work that they produce. So that the kind of work that they know and realize that the artworks that they produce are not merely art objects, okay? Because they are student artists, the works that they produce, okay, they are not merely art objects, or that can or should be a commodity or sold for an X amount of money, okay? In fact, they could and should use their creative license in reflecting, commenting, or communicating on what is happening around them, or as a sole representation of, or as the only sole representation or expression of his or herself, okay? But it can do more than that. So the artworks can do more than only be a form of expression. Socially, politically, economically, and even in making commentaries, or even in reiterating their religious belief. What I wanted the students, in this case, undergraduate students, to realize that what they produce, whether they like it or not, cannot be dissociated from a certain context, okay? So the context plays a role. So when I teach art history, I have to talk about the context of the works that I'm presenting, that I presented in class, okay? So if the student artists, produce a work and it gets circulated, it becomes a part of a network of cultural objects that gets to be appreciated, and most importantly, audience can engage with to make what they produce as something meaningful. On top of that, what I plan to do, or what I have been, the kind of philosophy that I have in my mind all this time is that I need to get the students to be more articulative, okay, either verbally or and also in their writing exercises, because although they can make they can make artwork, they can make beautiful artwork, they can have concepts or context in which that they present the artwork itself. But I think with the current, situation in the 21st century, the added points of having a good articulation will add to the conversation that they can bring with them into the work itself. Okay, so for me, artists today, it's not only making about work, but they can be able to articulate them about the artwork themselves. Okay, so on the point of how we can have a more effective collaboration in the region. First of all, I would like to thank the editorial team for organizing the roundtable, in which published in the recent journal publication in SEON. It is the fact that we are all engaged or have a fair interest in the study of the arts in the region. All of us here, we have very passionate interest in the study of the arts. Okay. But the reality is that we are mostly confined to our own institution. Either it is a teaching institution, or a museum, or a gallery institution with its own demand. Yet, without a certain leadership, or maybe a nudge or a bandwagoning of a like-minded people, collaboration can be, trying to get people to collaborate together can be quite a challenge. Okay. So I've been having this idea in my mind that we need to have a more common research projects, okay, or an annual seminar, or Southeast Asia SIHA, okay. But there must be a persistent follow-up to these ideas and a persistence of the people behind it as well. Okay, it cannot be an idea as an idea, but we need to have a set of people who are really pitching for this. Okay. So I guess that's it. That's for me for tonight. Let's go on to the the next presenter and to Thanavi. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarena. And we have the last panelist here, Brigitta Isabella from the School of Improper Education, KUNCI Study Forum and Collective. Please, Brigitta.
Thank you, Thanavi. And thank you to, of course, Thanavi and Simon and Peter. It's been a pleasure to hear the panelists' reflections on their pedagogical practice. Thanavi and Simon have put me in the last turn to speak, perhaps because I will also talk about School of Improper Education, which has a very different institutional context from what you've all been doing in the university environment, and perhaps with different sets of problem too. However, I do hope today that we can see how our different contexts of knowledge production might be cross-pollinated. So the School of Improper Education was formed in 2016. And when KUNCI came up with the idea to build a school, it was and still related to our concern with the sustainability of our collectivism. The sustainability of our finance is one thing, and as a collective that has survived for 20 years, we have been operating through self-funding as well as small and big grants from various foundations. But besides that, we are very much interested in the question of sustainability of ideas and collectivity. Our question is, what will sustain our togetherness and our collective knowledge production, even if one day we don't have money to keep KUNCI going? And this question perhaps become more relevant today as we have to think, even also in university environment, we have to think how to keep studying collectively when we are going to face major cuts in the art and humanities field, for example. So we start with that question in 2016, and we don't have the answer, and we want to extend this question to more people. Therefore, we decided to build school as something that will generate knowledge and experience on collectivity. So we published an open call in 2016, and I'm going to read the first paragraph of the open call, which goes like this. We are building a new school. The school is an experiment on the sustainability of both the material and immaterial economies of organization. We want to test the idea of school as a garden of ideas, a laboratory of affects, and a space where new ideas clash and coalesce. We are not sure about what can be learned in this school, but we are obviously sure about not to start from the premises that specify what needs to be learned and not learned. We want to study together while interrogating the meaning of togetherness. In this paragraph, I think it tries to show that we came to build a school that starts from collective unknowing, and we want to make a school where students will construct the time and space of studying together with us. The question of how we would construct our time and space of studying together, I believe, is inherently an aesthetic and political matter. Until now, we already have 2 batches of students, around 20 people in each batch, who are coming from different backgrounds, ranging from housewife, biology student, creative work freelancers, community activists, architect, artists, university lecturer, and so forth. And because of this diversity, in terms of the construction of studying time or the school schedule, we never have a fixed time because it's always depending on the availability of the group. And this has challenged us to think and negotiate on the accessibility of our school in terms of its duration and schedule. we have to always renegotiate. Oh, sorry for my dog. We have to always renegotiate every week to decide when will we meet, and sometimes we use polling. But when we see that certain people always cannot come, it's the time where we think about accessibility and privilege. For example, a woman who have to perform their domestic role as housewife often cannot come for sessions that happen in the evening. So we always keep this in mind because organizing a school is also a means to interrogate the structure of our togetherness. And it's definitely inefficient, but when efficiency means leaving some people behind, then we have to take a great care to the value of inefficiency. Now, on the question of how we study and what we study, what is clear is that KUNCI, as the initiator of the school, is not the authority or source of knowledge that determine what will be studied. And we also not studying art or art history in its narrowest sense. And I think all of you have shown how art history and art studies can be expanded. But what we are offering at the beginning are methods which explore the historical remnants of various studying practices in order to carve out what could be constituted as alternative way of studying. So I will talk briefly about 4 pedagogical concept, practice, and methods that we use so far since 2016. So it's been 4 years. In the first batch, we tested out 2 methods, which is Jacoto method. Jacoto method is reconceptualized by French philosopher Jacques Rancière in his book The Ignorant Schoolmaster. And we set up this method to demand for the recognition of universal intellectual equality and to propose possibilities for creating a learning environment from a situation where the students and the teacher do not know anything about a certain subject. So there is a radical equality between the student and the teacher. The second method was Turba. Turba is an acronym of turun ke bawah. The literal translation would be going below. And it is an artistic research and activism method formulated by left-wing art group in the 50s called LEKRA, Lembaga Kebudayaan Rakyat, or Institute of People's Culture in the 50s to 60s. And Turba encouraged artists and intellectuals to seek knowledge by generating dialectical progression with the wisdom of the masses. So it's a social realist principles, but with a particular method related with turun ke bawah, or going down to the people, and live there with them. Yeah, there's a lot of things to say about both of these methods, but I'm just going to state it very briefly due to our limitation of time. The other 2 methods that we have also tested out or practiced in the second batch of the students. The first one is nyantrik. Nyantrik, I don't think there is a equal translation in English for this, let's call it nyantrik. It's an aesthetic studying practice which has evolved from pesantren or the Islamic boarding school, and now often found in traditional performing art community. And nyantrik undoes the boundaries between life and study, and the process of acquiring knowledge in nyantrik is emphasized on the ability of students to become more sensible in their surrounding. And it's also related with embodied knowledge and how to transfer that, because it's often used in performing arts community. And the last one, which we haven't tested out, is Taman Siswa. Taman Siswa is the literal translation will be Garden of Students. We take this from Suwardi Suryaningrat teaching principle. So Suwardi Suryaningrat is often called as the father of Indonesian education. And the principle was formulated in 1922 as an attempt to counter the infantilizing moorings of the Dutch education in the colony. So with these four methods that we offer at the beginning, the participants read and seek for resources to understand more about each of these methodologies. Sometimes from reading, but also interview with people who has done these pedagogical methods. And after that, we will make a plan as where we will exercise this method. Sometimes collectively in small groups or individually. For example, with Turba, the participants choose to which below they want to go, while at the same time also question for the patronistic gaze of looking below that actually existed in the principle of social realism of the Institute of People Culture at that time. And we also try to contextualize what does below mean for us today. The School of Improper Education is now on our last stage of the Nyantrik method. And because of the pandemic and the physical distancing restriction that influence not only our ability to meet, because for some of our participants, it also means that they are now losing their job or having economic trouble. So we have been taking time to pause and use the school resource in terms of money, network, care, and attention to be used for helping participants and their respective social network who are facing economic problems. Now, as the physical distancing restriction has started to be relaxed in Yogyakarta, we begin to think to start again the school from the small garden that we have in KUNCI's backyard. It's interesting because the next method that we are going to test out or practice is Taman Siswa, again literally translated as Garden of Students. One of the things that has become clearer because of the pandemic is the question of food sustainability. And it actually makes us realize that crisis is always our context as precarious workers. So for us, it's a long-term question of how to practice collective resilience. In a smaller and community scale, some friends here in Jogja is initiating a common or public kitchen as a citizen initiative, as a direct response to the social impact of the pandemic, social and economic impact of the pandemic. And perhaps we will use that experience as a way to think and practice how we will develop our collective study. And from our backyard, we will be thinking what could Taman Siswa or the Garden of Students, which initially was built as a decolonial form of schooling, would mean to us today. I think that's it that I can share with you for now, and I'm looking forward for further conversation with all of you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigitta, and thank you everyone for your lively presentation and very informative and insightful. So we are going to have a Q&A session, but first Simon and I would ask you some questions that probably all of you want to respond or can respond. It's not a specific question to any of you in particular. So I would go first. I would like to ask you about the role of English language in your teaching of art history, because, for example, I could imagine that my students would find it very difficult to follow our conversation, not because of the subject, but because of the language that we speak, I mean, the ability in using English for most of us in Southeast Asia, maybe with the exception of Singapore, is a kind of privileged things. But in studying art history, many times you would need to refer to the concepts or new methodologies, new methods, or you simply want your students to read some article from international journal. But as English is not a native language or for most of us in Southeast Asia, how do you deal with this? For example, I would translate and summarize these things, and for reading English, I would select something easy, like some museum website, not so complicated for the student to be able to read, to comprehend. But I find it very difficult in trying to get them to a kind of another level of knowledge in art history, which require more or less their ability in using English, and this will lead to a possible collaboration in the future as well, even with the regional level, because we just need to use it. So I'm wondering, how do you deal with this maybe or maybe not a hindrance of teaching and learning art history?
Can I go first?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. As I mentioned just now, most of my classes are supposed to be in Malay, except for one, because it's e-coded. So that class, I'm free to use English all the time because it's an e-coded paper. So English is expected as the main communication in the class. But as you mentioned, Thanavi, the fact that there are a lot of materials which is, that you want them to read, and these are in English, okay, so it's kind of like inevitably they had to deal with this kind of material. So what I did was that I put in the course outline, to sort of like, to prep them ahead, okay, to give them somewhat a disclaimer saying that this class will be conducted in both Malay and also English, okay, to sort of like, once in a while I will like sort of like explain myself in English, then I've mentioned this to them, so much earlier, and some of the sources, as you and I know, these are the sources that, available in English, okay. So, but that makes my classes quite popular among exchange students, meaning that there are a lot of exchange students that goes to USM, and rather than taking a very difficult subjects, they think like art history would be like somewhat easier for them. But so my class becomes popular among international exchange students. Then I find myself like having to speak up in English most of the time. So for me, it is to a certain disadvantage to local students, because then they have to sort of like, back up with their English, strain their ears and trying to understand. But of course, I will try and do translation of that. So that is the kind of reality that I have to deal with, having, at least one international student in the class. To make it more inclusive, that I have to like speak up in English, but I would have to explain a couple of sentences in English, then explain in Malay and all that. So it is quite grappling, but this is what I told the students, that in the current situation, whether you like it or not, like being able to speak up or explain yourself in English, at least in basic English, because English is a secondary, a second language in Malaysia. So they should know or be able at least to say a few lines in English, and in the university level, they have to take a minimal English classes that they have to sort of pass. So, but then if they were to do presentations and all that, so I will encourage them to speak up, to speak in English, but I will not penalize them for not being able to, to speak in a fluent manner and all that. But as long as they try, so, the most important of all, that they can be able, or they try to communicate. So that's it. To sort of facilitate, so in my class, it becomes sort of both Malay and English all together come.
Thanavi, thanks for your question. I'm wondering actually that problem also applies in the reverse, because it's not always about students from certain regions not being able to cope with English, but it's also English-speaking universities not having a language requirement. And then that sort of puts a block when you're dealing with texts in the vernacular. And, that's been my experience running the Theories and Methods course, where the first half of the course is really straightforward because you're reading all your foundational thinkers from Vasari and Winckelmann to Panofsky. All these texts and writings have been translated. But the second half of the course deals with a wide geographical breadth. And there was one semester where I assigned Parul Dave Mukherjee, who's writing from a South Asian context about the applicability of Sanskrit texts, right, to, theories, aesthetic theories. Now, the problem was that there were several Sanskrit terms that reappear even in the English translation. And this text or this reading would have been easier to unpack in a South Asian context if I were teaching at a university in South Asia. And I didn't realize that before I assigned this. So it was extremely hard for the students to go beyond or to basically probe or to be able to grasp these terms. So I think that the question that you ask also applies in the reverse, that we really do not have enough English translations of regional or vernacular texts. And I'm wondering if that might change with the proliferation of archives such as the Asia Art Archives, where increasing numbers of regional texts and writings are being deposited. I don't know.
Does anyone else want to have a go, or should we ask the next question? There are a lot more questions sort of coming in now, so I highly encourage those with questions to start typing out your questions. We'll be answering this question shortly. Maybe a follow-up sort of question that I have in mind is to sort of think of the very rich sort of nuanced view of the genealogical singularity and experimental possibilities of teaching and learning art in each of our very context, right? I think you've all shared so generously about that. But I also got a sense that there are a lot of ethical sort of convergence, and in the spirit of trying to think about alliance making, what are the commonalities do you imagine that we can share, and what do you think we can actualize together following from this conversation? Sorry.
Sorry, Simon, if you could repeat the question.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So I got a sense there was as much as each in our every individual context is rather distinct, and we draw from intellectual genealogies that are quite sort of singular and unique. I was wondering if there are also sort of like ethical sort of convergence, or and in a spirit of sort of trying to think about alliance making, what commonalities do you imagine we can share, or what do you think we can actualize together following from this conversation? Maybe as an example, I would probably want to actually, it's good that you're raising your hand, Brigitta, because I was just about to point to, I guess, my privilege of having the opportunity to attend, for example, a KUNCI sort of like School of Improper Education session, where your whole process of going through a process of translating a text into Bahasa Indonesia from English is something that I applied to my teaching this semester with great success. I think there are sort of ways in which we can adapt each other's sort of like, model of sort of like teaching and learning as educators, perhaps share more resources on that, on those sort of like terms, in order to maybe sort of think more effectively about the questions of, the language sort of gap that many of us are encountering in our individual sort of like context. Do you have anything to add?
To just follow up about your story about when you came with your students to KUNCI, when we at that time held one of our school session, which I think it will also answer Thanavi's question on relation to English. At that time, we were reading a fragment of dissertation from one of our colleagues, which was written in English. And some of our participants cannot speak English, but some of them, well, mainly they all can read, but not fluently, right? I think that's sort of the general situation that we are all facing. But we also believe that reading foreign language text needs close reading. And translating is actually form of slow and close reading. So what we did together as a group was each participant can take turn in translating a paragraph together. So it became a very slow process, which actually show the different privilege and skills and knowledge that people have in English. But at the same time, people who, participants who have better skill in English, when they translate it out loud, actually they're also helping the other participant who cannot speak English. So I'm happy that what you got during the session was work as well in your context, because I actually, I was hesitant to share that method to the group, because I thought, oh, university curriculum have a very strict schedule, and we have the privilege to be very slow. Privilege and a choice to not be following this rhythm and temporalities of school, because we still want to think about what does it mean to be alternative. Now on the question of our alliance, actually I was very inspired by Stefano Harnik and Fred Moten, who was writing about the undercommons, particularly in university context, where they said that the only relationship that we can have, we as in the undercommons, people who wants to remain alternative, the relationship that we can have is to steal from the university. And by stealing, I mean it's not just that we as in us in the outside of the system, but also you guys who are inside the system, because you are our main contact who can help us to steal what we can from the university. Because university fundamentally is a capitalist institution, and it related with the whole social network that I don't think we have to make university better. What we have to do is just steal the resources and make something outside that will flourish more activism, more knowledge production, and in that way, I don't take antagonistic relationship with university, but rather more pragmatic and tactical, as you said. So that's how I imagine the kind of alliance that we can develop. But there also there's a problem where because for some people or workers who are working outside the university, we really precarious, and sometimes the university exploit our free labor. So that's also a thing that still remain in my head, in our head. Like, how can are we really stealing, or are they actually exploiting us? So the term of and condition of the collaboration has really to be recognized in ethical term, I think, with different precarity that we have. Yeah, that's my answer.
So I think there is a sort of follow-up question, maybe to sort of just quickly tack on to some of the questions that have already sort of come up. I think for Brigitta, Eric is asking whether you could explain a bit more about the process behind horizontal learning approach that you have spoke about between educators and students. He's interested to know how participants at KUNCI negotiate or decide on what and how they learn.
In terms of the term horizontal, I think we have to be careful with the simple division between vertical and horizontal, because what we want to do is not to make everything horizontal, because it can also be chaotic, but we want to distribute power and identify the unbalanced power relation to begin with. So it's more about distributing power to the whole participants. For example, we don't see ourselves as educator. We just a facilitator who happen to have space and money, small money. And when we have that space, we want everyone to feel belong to the space. And how to make them feel belong to the space is by giving them power to also determine together how to regulate this space and time together. So, for example, in each sessions, participants are asked to perform certain roles. So the roles are as a host, as a timekeeper, as a guardian of attention. So guardian of attention is someone who see whether there's someone who speak too much or haven't talked. And the last one is the one who make notes. So there are 4 roles that always distributed whenever we start a session. That's how we see horizontality works, by distributing power. And in your question related with how the participants or KUNCI negotiate or decides on what and how they learn, I think it's not really different from, for example, when you decide what kind of thesis topic that you want to write. It's always related with your personal interests, but also the collectivity happen when they share it with other people, their personal interests, and see whether it align with the other. So we don't have just what tie us is actually the methods. Everyone tested the same method, but in different topics. So that's how we do it. And thank you for the question, Eric.
Thanks for raising this sort of like question of power. I think this the follow-up question from sort of like Francis Marilas in some way sort of speaks to this. I think he wants to sort of understand a bit better, perhaps for our institutional sort of educators. If you could say something about the supervision of research thesis on Southeast Asian art and how research supervision as a form of pedagogy may be aligned with the students' needs over the life cycle of their candidature. Yes, please. Claire?
Hi. Yeah, I mean, in the MA Asian Art Histories program, I supervise a lot of theses and a lot of students who are very, very new to the fields that they are studying. So two of the kind of key questions that I really get students to focus on in the early stages of their thesis are, firstly, why? Why do you do this topic? Why is it important to write this thesis? And I think this is a really difficult question to answer because invariably the first answer that I get from students is no one's written about it before. And to me, it's not a sufficient response. You write on something because no one's written, but maybe there's a reason no one has written on that topic before. So in posing that question, already it ties back with that question of ethics. Who are you writing this for? It might be something you're very interested in, but how does this contribute to the field? How does this add something to a field that is emerging still in many ways? So that's the first question. And the second question is about methods. And so again, I find that students often come in with a lot of assumptions about the methodologies that they want to use when they're working on a thesis. The kind of assumption that they have to conduct interviews, or the assumption that they have to look at certain types of material. And again, it's a questioning of positioning in relation to the fields that they're studying. So if you need to take interviews, why do you need to undertake these interviews? What do you hope to get from them? What assumptions are you bringing to these interviews? If you need to look at an archive, why that archive? What are you hoping to find there? So I think that these are really sort of critical questions that are very much about becoming very much aware of one's position in relation to what we are studying, and also, of course, other researchers who are working in the field as well.
I want to try to sort of like combine these two questions, and I think it's possible to do that. It comes from Eileen and Fiona. I think Eileen mentions, Eileen sort of like frames a question around the thinking up or thinking through Southeast Asia. And how does it figure in your teaching? Realizing that many of you are practicing in different contexts and amongst diverse learners facing specific contingencies. How do you negotiate between situating tactically recourse to micro, local, or the vernacular versus expanding coverage to aspire trans-regional framing? I think the question in some ways relates to the English language point that raised by Thanavi. But Fiona then sort of like also has this interest in sort of like finding out everyone's opinion on reading canonical Western art history, texts like Baxendale, Panofsky, Derrida, Greenberg, as foundational sort of education. Is it taken for granted that art historians are repeatedly assigned these texts in Western universities, but she feels sort of like conflicted about inadvertently perpetuating a non-Southeast Asian forward curriculum in favor of a Western style art history with Southeast Asian examples? Does anyone want to have a go with this? Perhaps Flaudette or Priya?
Go ahead.
Maybe Priya.
Flaudette, you can go ahead. I'll answer after you. Go ahead.
Thank you. I will not directly answer the question about readings, but just to show the teaching methods, for example, the Department of Art Studies, or in our courses, we have already questioned repeatedly the survey mode, the linear chronological mode of teaching art history, which we have to learn anyway, which we have to call the attention of the students to. So we really have to go through the canonical texts, if only for them to learn them and then to critique them later against context. For example, when the students go out to the field already in folk cultures or indigenous cultures, the Vasari mode would definitely not apply. And the linear mode, the diachronic mode, also does not apply. So there are lots of methods from canonical art history that would not bear the test of context in the fields. So in relation to English, for example, we can't help it. We get the readings via English, and even translated in English from the French. We would have liked to read them in the original French, but nobody, or almost nobody, knows German or French, because when you read this, you also bring into the discussion or the radar the mode of thinking of that culture. And so what we do is, when we go to the fields, we try to, it is a standard operating procedure to look for vernacular and indigenous concepts. For example, the Western color wheel just doesn't apply in one particular group that looks at color botanically. I mean, purple is not purple, but something like ube, which is a fruit or a vegetable, a root crop in the Philippines. So the test, like I said, would be when you go out to the field. All right. So are we going to throw the baby with the bathwater? Of course not. We have to learn. The students have to know all these canonical texts. The better to deconstruct them and to test them against context. Okay. Secondly, we have a series of courses called Arts of the World, and we have instituted these courses in the 1990s as part of that decolonizing mode. No? And recently, we have learned that Yale is also going towards that direction. And we're just saying, I mean, no longer the survey mode, but the thematic mode. But these three Arts of the World courses, one is on Southeast Asia and the Pacific, another is on East Asia, and another one is on West Asia. I'm not very accurate. I couldn't remember accurately the geographical divisions. At the outset, we teach them thematically, like religion, politics, gender, race, etc. And we know that we cannot discuss everything in the linear mode, no? But just look for key themes. And probably that's in answer to the question of Simon, what commonalities could we see? And I could see it in terms of themes. Recognizing, of course, that we have different contexts. We're the only Catholic country in Southeast Asia. And I don't even know if it's, if it's really Southeast Asia because of our colonial history. So that has also to be taken into consideration, the specificities of this island nation colonized by the Spaniards, and therefore is Catholic, predominantly Catholic, vis-a-vis the others that are land-based, for example, and predominantly Hindu or Islamic, that sort of thing. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Priya, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I completely agree with Flaudette that, in trying to assign these readings, whether it's Vasari or Panofsky, Winckelmann, it's not about perpetuating a Eurocentric art history, but I think to be able to critique the Eurocentric provenance of art history, it's important to read these texts. Of course, a lot depends on what one can do with the second half of the module. So let's say you come into the module reading these texts and these foundational thinkers. What is it that you do with the second half is a question. And I think I spoke about that partially, that, for our theory and methods course, we have a very wide variety of readings that are assigned, starting with Patrick Flores to Parul Dave Mukherjee, Finbar Barry Flood, James Elkins. Now, it's not as if a module crafted in this spirit is going to be welcome. There are lots of suspicions and accusations. So, the same sort of charges that are made in the current debate about the feasibility of global art history, the same suspicions and accusations could be made for this second half of readings that we assign. And well, what are these sort of suspicions? I think art historians are very nervous that in trying to assign these sort of readings, art history is becoming diluted as a field, or there is this unnecessary infiltration of assorted epistemes within the field. So we have to also explain to the students why exactly are these readings or these authors being assigned, and what does it mean to arrive into art history via an alternative route, which might be anthropological, sociological, or ethnographic. And so I think in defense, it's important to cite, the works of scholars such as John Clark, Nora Taylor, Ashley Thompson, even Partho Mittar in the South Asian context, who have had to take these alternative routes to be able to provide alternative readings for Asian art histories. So it's not easy to design these courses on theories and methods. There are lots of hurdles in terms of faculty review committees and colleagues and platforms such as these, where it becomes important to explain why you go with this very diverse geographical breadth suddenly in the second half, when you're claiming that the program actually has a regional thrust. So there are these sorts of tensions that need to be negotiated.
Thank you. Great answer. Yes, Claire.
Sorry, just to quickly respond to Priya, it's just interesting to hear that that in her course that she's being asked to legitimize the inclusion of Asian centric texts, whereas in our case it's precisely the opposite, that if I ask students to read Derrida or Winckelmann or Greenberg, for example, then it's also seen as a sort of colonial infiltration of the course. So I think we also shouldn't think about this in binaristic terms. I've also found that some of the most productive comparisons between readings are not necessarily between readings from Eurocentric art history and Asian art history, but also art historians who are working on, say, South America or Africa. So I think that we also have to think about these sort of conversations that might be had in addition to Europe and Asia.
Can I just add? Okay,
Yes.
sorry. Can I add, because I think like both of you come from a purely art history department. I assigned this text, or this book is a book that is, the title is a compilation of, art history writings or writings about art. The book is titled The Nature of Art. Okay, so the theory and also methodology class is actually for 100 level, fine art students. So, which personally I feel it is a bit too heavy for a first year student. Okay, so but to bring that conversation in context is that what the thing that I bring from the readings taken from the book. I mean, of course, the selection from the books also goes Winckelmann and all the kind of like canonical selectively, authors or scholars. But the discussion, because the book was sort of like the selection of the paper or the introduction to the papers was sort of like posited in the discussion of the nature of art. So what art is or what art means in the various period of time. So I use that as a tool to sort of like tell or engage the students like with the fact that art means different things at different times within different geographical contexts. So so rather than sort of like just concentrating about the discussion of art history, so the discussion of the class will be what art means, or when, where, by who and all that. So so because to sort of like fine tune the kind of discussion to student artists, to sort of like how that kind of art historical positionings will be more relevant to them as student artists here. And also because of the second component of the subject itself will be more on the research writing. So I try not to be so heavy-handed on the theoretical aspect, but what I'm more interested will be how some of these points that that they have gotten from the readings can be applied in terms of their fundamental, formalistic analysis, that kind of thing, in terms of how they use citations, in terms of how they sort of like explore certain methodology, kind of like freestyle theory or application of theory paper, but is, taken from a certain points from these readings. Yes.
Thanks, Isabella. Sorry, Ellie, do you have Eksuda? Do you have?
Okay. Maybe just a quick word. I would like to offer the opposite case here at my department. From my experience as a student, because I'm also studying in my bachelor degree at the department where I work now, there is no such canonical art history in our program. This is in the past. Like, it's quite late before I know the names such Panofsky, Winckelmann, Derrida. So the teaching of art history at the department many years ago is like we just don't want to put that canonical text into the study of the Asian art, but actually it's quite the opposite, because the way in which that we taught or that I study the art history there is quite Eurocentric, because it follows the method of the French school of art history. Like I said, that we only focus on the dating and how to analyze the motifs or shape or the elements of such sculpture or architecture. So this is quite the opposite, and there's an explanation that related to Thanavi first question, because it's mostly come in English text, and because we try to convince ourselves that our materials is in Thailand or in Southeast Asia or in South Asia. So it's kind of close off the English text because of the language proficiency, as well as the nationalism of, because Thailand is never a colonized country. This is still quite a nightmare for teaching art history even nowadays. That's why I think we have quite a different situation here in art history teaching and studying in Thailand, that we don't include a canonical art history text until recently. Like I think it's in my subjects as well, or Thanavi will be part of, or the lecture that I teach in modern and contemporary art, that we start to introduce this text to our students. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Eksuda. I mean, that's a very interesting example that you've point to of a kind of exception, and in some ways it almost answer a question from Wei Xiang, who was asking, about sort of like the canon of foundational texts. I think his question perhaps is more directed to Priya, but also in general. Generally, it's open to everyone who wants to take a stab at it. What is it about these texts that make them canonical or foundational to art history, such that there is a sentiment of needing to teach students these first before critique can happen? Would it be possible to teach localized art histories to our students as their foundation, then with an option to move on to these assumed foundational texts, presumably from the Western canon? Yes, Flaudette, you want to have a go?
The question, it's a question of positionality. Our core courses would deal first with positionality. And we have recently revised our curriculum and strengthened the Philippine art strand, and has one course devoted to Philippine art perspectives. It's a question also of organization, teaching delivery, or if the course is on approaches and methods of art history, then it is incumbent upon us to explore or make the students knowledgeable in the foundational texts of the West, But before they do so, we have already given them the position, the subject position, and that is one of resistance, one of the mystification, and one of decolonization. So when we give them the readings, the criticality is already built in. And like I said, we cannot discuss Western and then vis-a-vis Philippine art. We have to have different, or we have to have separate courses, to tackle those. We cannot. So sometimes a semester would be devoted to Eurocentric readings, or what we call foundational, and we call them traditional art history, traditional readings. That's how we call them. And it's unavoidable to do that. But like I said, we have already given them the critical position or the critical perspective. So yung the what comes first, the chicken or the egg, it all depends on how to deliver knowledge, and we felt that, you know, this first or that first, it would depend on how the student would, on the student's problem, no? Because when they come into the curriculum, they already have in their minds some field or some area of inquiry that they would like to explore as they go through their undergraduate or graduate years. So I hope that answers the question. What makes them foundational? Foundational because it's art history. It's old art history vis-a-vis alternative or new art histories. And in fact, in the Philippines, or at least in the department, this makes us anxious. We're dealing with the anxiety of context, and we have already gone through a long debate about this. Do we start with this? Or do we start with this? Or how do we deal with this? Can we just pick from Vasari to Winckelmann and go straight to Flores and Clark? These are decisions that we really have to discuss. But like I said, the entry point is the nationalist orientation and the post-colonial orientation. I'm done.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Flaudette has said. And just a very simple point to add on here. Art history as a discipline was institutionalized in the German-speaking world, in Europe. And hence, a lot of the writings that come from that part of the world by default become foundational. Now, this is not to say that we did not have writings on the visual arts or on, you know, various theories to do with aesthetics. I mean, we have a lot of older writings in India and in China, but they did not necessarily appear under the rubric of art history. So I think therein lies the difference as to why a lot of these texts that we read are by default treated as foundational to the discipline.
I think we have sort of, yes, please, Sarena.
Sort of like getting, a take from Priya's point over there, because I'm not a subject expertise of Chinese art history or even India, Chinese civilization and also Indian civilization. But I think in a way it is possible, although Priya did mention that it's, art history started, in German and all that. But I think if there are many art historiography, art writings in India and also in China, because they have longer art, longer history of art, there is a possibility for them to create their own canonical text or foundational art history within context of India or Chinese civilization that could sort of like add to what the current discourse of art history is. I think that's a possibility, but then of course I'm not the subject expertise of these two nations, and of course Malaysia art history is quite recent and new. Yeah.
I think we've gone past our allotted time, but I just want to sort of like quickly acknowledge a few other sort of like questions that have been asked. I think Kelvin asked about whether art history is still largely defined or taught by nationalistic boundary. I guess from our sort of like panelists, you would perhaps also sense like the answer is both yes and no, depending on each of our contexts, right? And there's also another question asking about resources, where are these sort of like the importance of access to archives and primary resources in your teaching. Maybe we won't sort of go into that. Another question on sort of like how do we teach contemporary art when this thing is still an ongoing thing. But as a way to perhaps wrap up our sort of session, maybe I thought we could focus and hone in on Ika Rahidi's question, in which she asked, she's very curious about KUNCI's sort of like methods of Nyantrik and Taman Siswa practice, and whether Brigitta can elaborate slightly a bit further, and for us to sort of collectively think whether these methods could be then applicable to teaching in a university context.
Thanks, Simon. And thanks, Icha. Hi, Icha. Well, I cannot say a lot about Taman Siswa because we haven't practiced that. That's the upcoming stage that we're going to do after this. But in relation to Nyantrik, so Nyantrik is an ascetic practice coming from actually Hindu and Islam modes of learning, and it is a principle that wanted to break the boundaries between life and studying by using the bodies as a means to absorb as well as produce knowledge. That's why it's often used in traditional performing art practices. And what is required is the student to perform laku, and laku is literally translated as practice, but repetitive, intense practice. For example, one of the dance and performance artists who practice this nyantrik as a way of teaching performing arts is Bagong Kusudiarja. He's also a painter actually, and like when we interview one of his former student, the student really remember there is one task where the students are brought to a beach and they were asked to only look at the wave for hours and not saying anything. And after that, they were asked to imitate the movement of the waves. In a way, perhaps the way you guys talk about the materiality and the detail of archives, for example, is kind of laku or practice in a very different sense. But if we look...
Like visual analysis almost. Yes, so work of art.
But in a more fundamental question in relation to whether it's applicable to university, again, for example, Turba, the turun ke bawah method, the going to below, has been used by the university, at least in Jogja, for students to pass the last stage of their study at the university. They have to do live-in for 2 months in villages. But then when it was institutionalized, it becomes like just a formal thing to do. Because the principle has gone, the context has gone, the context from which it actually really related with the spirit of people power, for example. It has been lost when it was turned just for students to get a grade. So when we talk about nyantrik, I think it's emphasized on laku as an intense and repetitive practice that should happen, that should blur the boundaries between life and study. Somehow the duration and the way it structures, like there is no grade, there is no certificate, you don't have to pay. I think this kind of traditional way of teaching is actually something that perhaps we all have in Southeast Asian context. Our way of studying in pre-colonial period, because university is fundamentally a colonial institution. So I think it's not just about the reading that we have to decolonize, but also the university itself as a exploitative machine that we use to produce workers. But again, art has the ability to make people think critically. So I'm not really being antagonistic at all. I believe university is a pool of resources that we have to use to make things happen outside. So yeah, maybe not apply it. take your students outside.
Does anyone want to share their experience on how there might be an approximate kind of like practice or thinking or to either the practice of Nyantrik that Gita have just sort of like shared with us? Maybe your emoji.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that it's an approximation, but I do think the question of duration is an interesting one to think about when we're teaching. I have been working with a colleague at Goldsmiths on a project that uses techniques from interpretive phenomenological analysis, which essentially means just really deep kind of interviewing techniques. And so we've been thinking about how to use these this kind of mode of extensive interviewing as a type of visual analysis as well. So I think you're right, Simon, that it becomes a type of visual analysis, and it becomes a sort of commitment to really spending a lot of time with materials in as opposed to kind of jumping to conclusions or using whatever received knowledge you have to interpret them.
Anyone else who wants to jump in? May or Sarena? Eksuda, Priya. This is our last round. We're going one round to sort of like, share with each other our concluding thoughts. Or Achan Thanavi.
Or maybe you, Simon.
I'll think of something intelligent to say. Or are we a bit sort of like spent and we should sort of perhaps continue this conversation on another day? If so, on behalf of the editorial sort of committee, I would really like to thank all our panelists, as well as all the attendees this evening for joining us in this conversation. This is a first amongst many that we hope to host in the future. And if you have any sort of like feedback or comments, do continue to sort of like send them to us. Participate in our sort of Facebook group. That's where we're hoping to also sort of like build this community of readers of the journal who is interested in continuing to sort of like ask interesting questions about the study of art history. So thank you very much, and thank you once again to US Press. As well as our sort of funders for helping making this a possibility. Thank you. Thanks. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much for this evening. It's very great.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you all of you.
It was great weekend.